some people still logging on. Thank you. Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Beta Tau chapter of Delta Omega's 2021 Advances in Public Health lecture. I am Diane Marie St. George. I'm the director of the MPH program here in the School of Medicine at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. Before we get started this afternoon, I have a few housekeeping details to review. All session attendees will be muted throughout the session, and your cameras will also remain off. We have allotted time at the end of the session for questions. If you wish to ask a question, please use the chat function. We'll be monitoring the chat throughout the session, and we will share your questions at the end with our speaker, Dr. Edwards. This lecture is being recorded, and you'll be able to access the recording from our website after National Public Health Week ends. If you are a physician and would like to receive CMEs for attending today's session, please click the link in the chat box that just was posted in chat to submit your request. That's a form that will allow you to document your attendance here, and we can take care of that for you. Just so you know, this lecture is one of several National Public Health Week events occurring on campus this week. The Wellness Hub is raffling off prizes each day of National Public Health Week. Students can be entered into the daily raffle by attending any UMB-sponsored event for at least 45 minutes. So just so you know, only UMB students are eligible to win a raffle item. So unfortunately, I can't put my name in the hat. But if you'd like to learn more, please go to the website www.umaryland.edu/wellness. That was just put into the chat. The next campus-sponsored National Public Health Week event will be this evening at 5 p.m. It is a workshop focusing on empathy in the context of mental health and its impacts on the patient, family, and community. This is before and since the COVID-19 pandemic. For more information about that, again, go to that wellness website that was just posted in the chat. So I believe that covers all the housekeeping items. So let's get started. As I noted earlier, this is the Delta Omega 2021 Advances in Public Health lecture sponsored by our chapter here in the MPH program, the Beta Tau chapter. The Delta Omega Honorary Society in Public Health was founded in 1924 at Johns Hopkins University within their School of Hygiene and Public Health. The society was formed to encourage and recognize excellence in practice, research, education, and academic achievement in the field of public health. Currently, there are over 100 chapters, and our chapter was established in 2010. In 2018, the Beta Tau chapter had its inaugural Advances in Public Health lecture. So this is, I believe, our third. We had to cancel last year for obvious reasons. So today we have Ms. Joanna Henry with us to introduce our 2021 speaker. Ms. Henry is an alumna of our MPH program and was also inducted into our chapter in 2019. She currently serves as the chair of our chapter's program committee. So thank you, Ms. Henry, for your service to the chapter and for introducing our guest speaker this afternoon. So I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. St. George, for that lovely introduction. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mark Edwards. Dr. Edwards is a University Distinguished Professor of Civil Engineering at Virginia Tech, where he teaches courses in environmental engineering, applied aquatic chemistry, and engineering ethics. His research group conducted the investigative science uncovering the 2001 to 2004 DC lead crisis and the 2014 through 2016 Flint water disaster. Time magazine dubbed Dr. Edwards the plumbing professor in 2004, listing him amongst the 4 most important innovators in water from around the world. The White House awarded him a Presidential Faculty Fellowship in 1996. He won a MacArthur Fellowship in 2007. And in 2013, Dr. Edwards was the 9th recipient in a quarter century of the IEEE Barnes Award for courageously defending the public interest at great personal risk. In 2016, he was named amongst Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world, the world's 50 greatest leaders by Fortune magazine, Politico magazine's top 50 visionaries who have transformed American politics, Foreign Policy magazine's 100 world's greatest thinkers, and was shortlisted amongst Flint whistleblowers as Time Persons of the Year. He was co-recipient of the inaugural 2017 MIT Disobedience Award, received the 2018 AAAS Scientific Freedom and Responsibility Award, and the Hoover Humanitarian Medal in 2019. Additionally, Dr. Edwards was inducted into the Delta Mu chapter of Delta Omega at Virginia Tech and by the National Executive Board of Delta Omega as an honorary member in 2018. Please welcome Dr. Edwards, and thank you for joining us.
Experiences. I guess I'm unmuted now. To talk about some of my experiences over the last 15 years where trying to speak truth in an age of tribalism and the lessons I've learned from various water crises. And this is, let me apologize at the outset, this is going to be a very difficult talk for you to listen to because it's unpleasant and it's even harder for me to give. And if I'm successful, the main goal I'll accomplish is to make sure that none of you listening today will be as dangerously naive about misconduct in public health agencies as I was at age 40. So this all really started for me in about 2003 when I was hired by the US EPA to solve what I thought was going to be a routine problem with lead in drinking water of Washington, D.C., and it later turned out to be a major public health crisis. And today I want to review for you 3 things. First off, some key questions associated with ethical dilemmas. Secondly, the dangers of politicized science, especially in public health agencies. And thirdly, just how bad this is all going to go for us if we don't get our act together. So first of all, I would like to start with the issue of ethical dilemmas. And what you'll discover when you encounter an ethical dilemma in your professional career, not if, is that what makes this so difficult, it comes down to where do your loyalties lie? And I think a life worth living really comes down to, for each of us, what causes, if anything, are worth dying for. And when I say dying for, I mean not just your mortal life, but also what things are you willing to lay your professional life down for as well, if any. So let's start out by discussing the issue of competing loyalties. First of all, we all need to be loyal to ourselves to provide the necessities of food, water, and shelter, because if that did not happen, we would die personally and our species would go extinct. But secondly, humans are a little bit unique, kind of like ants and bees, in that we have a higher loyalty than loyalty to ourselves, and that is known as tribalism, where on occasion, we sacrifice ourselves, things to our benefit unselfishly for the benefit of our friends, family, our institution, and profession. And this is what has made us so successful as a species. Some might argue that we've been a little bit too successful, but it's important to note that this tribalism, higher loyalty, is just absolutely evolutionarily hardwired into our DNA. So much so that if you go back to the 1400s when Dante famously wrote the Inferno and talked about all the different crimes that humankind can commit and ranked them, it's interesting to note that Dante's punishment of criminals had different layers of hell depending on the severity of the crime. And the innermost, worst layers of hell weren't reserved for those who committed murder or rape or genocide. The innermost layers of Dante's hell and human hell are reserved for those who betray their benefactor or their tribe. And this is just absolutely who we are. I often say, if you ever want to live hell on earth, expose wrongdoing by your friends or institution and be proven right. You will absolutely be punished, shunned, and shamed for doing the right thing. So it's interesting to consider that this loyalty to our tribe was only superseded in recent centuries by the discovery of higher loyalties, loyalty to the truth in Western countries through the innovation of science, and loyalty to humankind in a lot of Eastern civilization in the context of social responsibility. And it's important to note that almost all of the recent human advancements of the last 2 centuries are dependent upon those higher loyalties. Your loyalty to truth, your loyalty to humankind, superseding your hardwired loyalty to tribalism and to yourself. And so this is the dilemma that we often face. What are you going to be loyal to? Because implications come with selecting your priorities. Now, we know that loyalty can be misplaced. So for example, if you're too loyal to yourself, that's known as narcissism or selfish behavior, and society and your friends will rightly punish you if you are too self-centered. Likewise, we know that tribalism can go awry as well, and as evidenced by this young fan of football at Virginia Tech, and you get an idea of how carefully we teach our children about tribalism and loyalty. And this has manifested itself not only in the good things that loyalty to your tribe can do, but also our very violent history, wars, and other problems. And so if you ever live in a time where those loyalties get misplaced, things get out of balance. And so to oversimplify a social commentary of that, there are many people who believe, and we don't really know why, that we're currently living in a time of a narcissism epidemic. Some say it's social media, some say it's other things. We don't really know, but the studies show it's a very real problem, being too loyal to yourself. Likewise, we also have runaway political tribalism, or us versus them. And if the loyalty to these issues is increasing, something has to give. And very simply, in this case, it means our higher loyalty, our loyalty to the truth or to humankind. And as a result, that is why we're living in a post-truth world. So I think one of the questions I want you to think about today, and as you go through your career, is what price are you willing to pay, or how much are you willing to sacrifice to uphold the truth in a world that's not going to appreciate you doing so? So For me, I started to kind of realize these issues when I started to uncover the depths of the Washington, D.C. lead crisis. It's a really long 7-year story. There's a lot written about it on the web. But basically, what happened was lead in Washington, D.C. water was high for about 3 years. Residents were not told about it. And this is now recognized to be one of the world's public health disasters and tragedies, even though you probably haven't heard about it. The best science has shown that because of that high lead in DC water, about 2,000 children were not born due to high miscarriage risk. There's about 200 excess fetal deaths, and literally thousands of young DC children had their blood lead elevated above 5 or 10 micrograms per deciliter. Now, one of the things that makes this public health crisis so interesting is the fact that it's the first and perhaps best example where the misconduct, the tragedy arose 100% through the fault of government scientists and engineers. A lot of health tragedies are attributed to a profit motive or greed. No such luck here because all the agencies involved in perpetrating this crime and covering it up were public health agencies. And the second thing that makes this so interesting is that there's absolutely no disputing the harm that lead does to children. It's official US government policy that any level of lead exposure is a problem. And we routinely throw landlords into jail, for example, if they do not disclose a lead paint risk to their tenants. And so what fate should befall those public health officials who allowed this tragedy to occur in Washington, D.C. through their illegal behavior? Now, it's interesting to think a little bit about how something like this could occur. How can public health agencies go off course? And I spent a little bit of time looking into this issue over the last 3 years, and what I attribute it to, in part, is yes, not just declining ethics and morals, but also some dangerous political biases that have come into our public health institutions. And it's interesting, at the time this lead in DC water crisis occurred and was covered up by the US Centers for Disease Control, they were pursuing a lead paint liability case, which was based on the US historic tobacco settlement, where the government settled with tobacco agencies and literally tens of billions of dollars were given to government agencies from the tobacco industry to do good deeds. And a 2007 New York Times article kind of looked into this lead paint lawsuit and really had a skeptical take on it because they just pointed out that these lawyers aren't always on the side of angels. They can be abusing the legal system, and sometimes this litigation looks more like an income redistribution racket than a search for scientific truth or justice. How does this affect, CDC? Well, they wanted that money. They wanted the billions of dollars to do their good deeds, at least in their minds. And so the head of the lead paint poisoning prevention branch at the US Centers for Disease Control was Mary Jean Brown. And she was actually boasting in the paper that her lead research would aid plaintiffs who were waging these legal battles against lead paint manufacturers. And at one point, she was actually interviewed to be a special master to oversee the spending of those billions of dollars. And kind of a cornerstone of her case led to what I consider to be a complete hypocrisy, which is if all lead exposure is bad, we should be worried about lead exposure from lead paint and lead in water. But to the extent lead in water caused problems, that would undermine the lead paint lawsuit. So it put CDC in a biased position where they wanted to claim that every child lead poisoned in America came from lead paint and that lead in drinking water never hurt anyone. And it's interesting to think that the lead pipes that provide this water to homes are government owned. They're there because of government laws. And it's just the reality that government doesn't do a very good problem recognizing or fixing problems that they create. And so this creates a very serious conflict of interest, which I think played a role in what actually happened. But To make a long story short, the CDC published a completely falsified and fabricated report that lied and blamed all the lead poisoning in DC during the water crisis on lead paint. And it took me 7 years to expose that. It was ultimately a bipartisan congressional investigation in 2010, which concluded that Ms. Brown, CDC's research covering up all the harm from lead in DC water was completely scientifically indefensible. And if you ever want to read a public health horror story, read this report from 2010. And so initially I was involved in this, and the 7-year ordeal was over, and I thought, okay, CDC has been caught. They will reform themselves, but unfortunately that's not what happened. Basically, CDC gave everyone the finger and would not punish anyone who did anything wrong. They would not accept any responsibility. And so that old adage that if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it, that is all too true. Next slide. So they got a lot of bad press at the time, but really their lessons learned, because no government official was ever fired or demoted for all that harm that was done. In fact, they were rewarded. They were given their agency's highest honor for covering this up and keeping their agency out of trouble. Whereas what was truly horrifying about it, all these perpetrators of the crime got off and rewarded, and I discovered there were 5 whistleblowers, 5 brave people who laid down their professional life to expose what was done, and they all lost their job. Now, 2 of these folks later won whistleblowers lawsuit, but they were never employable again. And this is how we treat these brave individuals who speak the truth, who expose wrongdoing. They lived human hell on earth for doing the right thing. And if that's how you run your world, why are you surprised when these agencies become corrupt? Why are you surprised when this misconduct continues over and over again? We never learn. We never learn a lesson from it. So the lessons that were learned by these agencies were defend the bad actors who perpetrate these crimes and unethical behavior, attack the good people. But because we can kind of get away with anything, we proved that in DC. But let's get better at covering these problems up, because it was a lot of bad publicity for us, and so that led me to realize that something like DC was just inevitable. So I spent a couple of years speaking out in vain, trying to stop it from happening, but it was no use. And so that is what brought us in 2014 to Flint. And the Flint story is interesting because, here's the famous ribbon cutting ceremony where they were switching their water sources to save a few $1 million per year. They had been relying on Detroit for many, many decades, and they could save money by treating their own water at the Flint River. And this actually proved to be quite true. It was a historic step for us to turn on that treatment plant, not for the reasons that they thought, because someone forgot to implement federal corrosion control law. They forgot to put a chemical in the water that would stop the lead from contaminating the water supply. And so what happened was the residents immediately knew something was horribly awry. This is a picture of the type of water that was coming out of the tap of one of the residents. That's Leanne Walters, my friend, hero mom, and eventually won the Goldman Prize for environmental activism. But she's holding water up from her home after it was filtered. And she's complaining to this government official, and that government official is telling her that, frankly, he doesn't believe that that's her water, but even if it is, he's been told it's completely safe to drink. So this sort of thing went on for about a year and a half, and eventually Leanne and I started working with a brave EPA scientist, Miguel Del Toro. And Miguel is interesting because he's the foremost expert on the lead and copper rule in the country. And he saw what was happening. He was just so upset that they were not following federal corrosion control law in June. He actually wrote a memo to his own agency outlining the health danger. And he did this because he knew that his agency was inherently corrupt and they would not want to do their job and enforce implementation of this federal law. And so he figured that he was going to let this information get out and they would be forced to do their job. And this is a line from the memo, pointing out that there's no federally mandated corrosion control treatment in the city of Flint. Let's do something about it. But Miguel was retaliated against immediately by the head of EPA Region 5, who didn't want to do her job. And so he was placed essentially under house arrest and told that he was never to speak to anyone from Flint or about Flint again. And so this illegal behavior was allowed to be continued beyond that time. Next slide. So the next day after he knew that he was taken out of the loop, he wrote an email to his colleagues where he said, I'm really tired of the bad actors being defended, bad actions being ignored, and people who are trying to do the right thing being subject to intense scrutiny as if they are doing something wrong. I truly, truly hate working here. EPA is a cesspool. But Miguel's out. And what's interesting in these agencies is, when a good person goes down, someone who's learned how to survive steps into the breach and does the agency's bidding. And here's just an example of Jennifer Crooks at EPA, who was getting complaints about Flint water, writing to her colleagues, yep, another complaint about our favorite water supply, smiley face. Let me tell you, this is a nasty issue. I've had people call me 4-letter words over the phone, yell at me and call me a crook. But I'm developing a thick skin. And if you're not careful, that's what these agencies in the public health community will teach you. To be unempathetic, look the other way, and develop a thick skin and allow some of our most vulnerable citizens to suffer the consequences. Next slide. So at this point, we had been trying to stay out of the spotlight. People were marching in the streets. Folks had rashes. Crap water was coming into their bathtub. But Flint residents were being wrongly told that their water is safe to drink by the EPA, by the state health department. And we knew that this was wrong. So the mayor of Flint, who's a Rhodes Scholar, Democrat, actually reached out to EPA and said, I read that EPA scientist memo. Like, is there anything to it? And she wrote back and said, no, there's nothing to it at all. If there ever is, we'll get in touch with you. Happy 4th of July. So this guy, who's very caring, good guy, went on TV to drink the water. And he took a big hit for that because this is what people remember. And I'll say, yeah, it's true. It takes two people to lie. It takes someone to believe the lie, which in this case was the mayor. It takes someone to tell it, which was the state and the EPA. And who's more guilty? In my mind, it's the scientist who told the lie, not the government official who relied on it. But people can't wrap their heads around this. They always want to try to blame this on a politician when in fact, this tragedy was caused by public health agencies and engineers and scientific misconduct and criminal behavior. That's a fact. And people just cannot wrap their heads around it. This is so bad that the government officials actually make the public health agencies look ethical by comparison. That's how screwed up this is. Next slide. So at that point, we kind of got really, really mad. This is to signify my emotion and kind of going blank. And we knew this day would come and we were preparing for it. We'd saved up money and basically, we knew that we were essentially going to be waging war against these unethical health agencies. And so we were self-funded. I'd saved up money. We sought to do science as a public good directly in collaboration with the public and in confrontation with the public health agencies if necessary. And here's kind of how our battle plan rolled out. So one of the things I learned over the years is that if you want to cause change, you have to fight these battles to win. You have to tell a story that people can understand and appreciate. And this is called the heroic journey. It goes to Joseph Campbell. If you don't know this, you better learn about it. But we chose to tell the heroic journey of Flint residents and to, frankly, embarrass these agencies to do their job. Next slide. So this was our first announcement that we were going to get involved, sending out sampling kits to Flint and promising to do the job these agencies refused to do, which was to sample the water and see if it was safe for lead. Next slide. The other thing we had to deal with is the media, who has a very limited attention span and understanding of science. And so we had to kind of show what was going on in simple terms. And we created these little simple bench scale experiments that virtually anyone can understand. So here's a picture of Flint water, which they were on now without corrosion control, and the old water below with Detroit. And we just took that water and exposed it to some iron samples representing iron pipe. And you could kind of just hold it up and show, hey, Flint water without corrosion control, it's getting discolored, it looks like crap. This is what you expect if you don't follow federal law. Flint residents are not crazy. So this was one of the things we did to prove the science of this point. Next slide. The other thing we did is we did other experiments with lead, and what you're seeing here are the Flint water on the right and the Detroit water on the right, Flint water on the left. It's a piece of copper with lead in it. You see all that white stuff in the water with Flint? That's lead in the water. That's literally hazardous waste levels of lead. That's what you expect if you don't have corrosion control in the water. Looks like a snow globe. Detroit water doesn't have that level of lead. So we did that experiment. One of the great things about science is that it's reproducible, which means that I can do it in my lab and EPA or the state of Michigan can do it in their lab. So we actually sent these bottles and told them how to do it by just filling up the two sources of water, which were in their building. They were telling everyone that we were liars and that, you know, there was no problem in Flint. And so I said, well, repeat the experiment then. Tell us what you find. What do you think happened? I'll tell you what happened. They wouldn't do the experiment. You cannot reason with unreasonable people. So what we did is we went out and reached out to a fourth grade science room who did the experiment. They saw the exact same thing we did, and they got on TV, and it was complete and utter total humiliation for the public health science agencies. Next slide. And then we kind of went nuclear on them, and this should probably be outlawed by the Geneva Convention of Scientific Interventions, but we had a Brownie Troop scientist do some experiments, and they wrote some letters to the governor, and it went viral on the media, and again, embarrassed the agencies. I took those letters, I packaged them up, and I also sent them to EPA headquarters in Washington, D.C., and I said, isn't it interesting, these little Brownie Troop scientists get this and you folks don't. Next slide. So we also went up and stood with the Flint residents to announce our results, which showed that lead in water was a citywide problem. And this is the front page headline the next day where I said this is an epically bad decision. And next slide. And at that point, it really started to pick up in the media because people could sense that the house of cards was about to collapse. Next slide. We worked with a pediatrician, Dr. Monahan Atisha, who's in Flint, and she did some blood lead studies that showed, just like you'd expect based on our water lead measurements, that the blood lead had risen for a few months to about double the level for 5 micrograms per deciliter and higher. Next slide. And so within 6 weeks after we got involved, this was front page in the New York Times. Next slide. We also were worried about dangerous bacteria in the water, which also resulted from a failure to follow federal law. And we showed that there were about 12 deaths due to high Legionella in the water. So it wasn't just lead, it was Legionella. Next slide. And so at this point, you know, the whole story started going viral. It was front page of Time magazine. President Obama declared a federal emergency. FEMA was mobilized and started to distribute water in the city, and they also did blood lead testing of children. This is what a downtown commute occasionally looked like in Flint, because not only was there high lead and Legionella, but their pipes are in horrible shape, and the lack of corrosion control didn't help, so the pipes would break and you get flooding. And, you know, it really was the end of civilization as we know it. That's the experience of Flint residents. And so this is the first congressional hearing where I was fortunate enough to testify with my friend, hero mom, Leanne Walters, on my left there. And then the next hearing was a little bit less comfortable because there's Miss Susan Hedman down at the far right who punished Miguel for doing the right thing and told the mayor there was no problem. And so it was interesting. You know, I mean, I've been involved at this point. It's like 2016, 13 years I've been dealing with these public health agencies' corruption. And you just go to yourself, what does it take to get someone fired in this country for unethical and illegal behavior at a government agency? Seriously. No one was punished in DC except the whistleblowers. Here we've got a city with damaged infrastructure. They broke the law. High lead in the drinking water, some elevation of the blood lead in children. People died from Legionnaire's disease. What does it take? So at that point, it was interesting because something, it finally got on Comedy Central. So we're just going to play this Comedy Central clip here.
The saddest thing about this leak is how little it would have cost to prevent it all.
The fix was about $100 a day. All of this could have been avoided for just that small amount of money.
$100 a day. Why didn't you say something? I want to call out to all my people in Africa right now watching The Daily Show. Because my friends, for only $100 a day, we can save a village in America and get these people drinking the water that they so badly need for just the price of 5 cups of coffee in New York.
Okay, so you know, you laugh or else you'd cry, but you know, I think what you can see is that we became a national and international embarrassment. Our tribe, the United States of America, if you are judged by how you treat your most vulnerable, we did not look very good. And at that point, if you've embarrassed the tribe, some heads have to roll. That's what it takes. So it wasn't long after that, Susan Hedman was forced to resign in the wake of the Flint water crisis. There were 15 civil servants indicted, and criminal prosecutions are still going on. It's the most expensive trial in the history of the state of Michigan. Next slide. And, you know, but then I was part of the response too. And, you know, so one day I'm fighting these agencies and it never happens, but the next day they're apologizing to me and Miguel del Toro, and we're working with them to help get the city of Flint fixed. I mean, a million years that doesn't happen, but it happened. And so we worked together and they did a fantastic job. And it's a picture of the water during the crisis in McLaren Hospital. See a lot of milky brown water, growing Legionella, not surprising. After the crisis, the water, not surprisingly, you spend $100 million, it gets way better and switch back to the original source. But, you know, the problem is once trust is lost, deservedly lost, how do you ever get it back? Why should people trust public health agencies if they're not trustworthy? And so one of the things you've learned is that that's all that's necessary for a new dark age. It is said that famously Latin horror vacui, which means nature abhors a vacuum. If we are not deserving of the public trust, other less reliable sources of information will move center stage. And that's what happened in Flint. And there are many examples, but I'll just give one because it's been documented quite well and it's the subject of a new documentary film. But next, Mark Ruffalo, the actor, came to town with his nonprofit Water Defense. And this is after the federal emergency was declared. And they started declaring that there were all these dangerous chemicals in Flint's water that the agencies were lying about and hiding from the public, and actually claiming that it's dangerous to bathe in Flint's water, which every public health agency at the time said was not true for normal people. The water was no more dangerous than anywhere else. But this rumor spread, and there were academics who were also pushing this kind of false narrative. And the CDC actually did a study of residents who had rashes that showed 80% of those had changed their bathing habits. There were other studies that showed 50% of all residents changed their bathing. Now, one of the problems that they had, of course, basic hygiene is very important to prevent all sorts of communicable diseases. But not long after Water Defense and Ruffalo arrived in town and started scaring people, they started experiencing a Shigella outbreak. And the best answer to fix the Shigella problem is to improve washing of hands and basic hygiene. But how can you do that when the wrong message is being sent at the wrong time in the wrong place? Now, we can't prove cause and effect. We can't say that it was this fear that caused Shigella to occur, but the rumor got out that the Shigella was actually coming from the water, and that by washing your hands, you were doing the worst thing possible instead of the normal route, and by which it was later proved to be communicated with normal person-to-person contact. So this was really horrifying, and we got into a nasty fight with Mr. Ruffalo. At first, we tried to reason with him. We set up meetings. He didn't show up. We said that if you didn't stop spreading information, we're going to call you out. And he blew us off. And then he later formed this. So we started calling him out. And he later formed this alliance with this group. Keep going. It's called TYN Politics Network. Supposedly the largest online news organization in the world, and together they presented this false narrative, in our opinion. So what I'm about to show you is horrifying. I wish we didn't have to do what we did, but we felt we had to fight fire with fire, for better or for worse. And so next slide, there's a little trigger warning here that this is for mature audiences only, because you're about to see actual videos presented on the internet that some might find comedic, some might find horrifying, but we rated it F for fear mongering. So you've been trigger warned, okay? So what we did is first showed some of their methods that they were using to gather their so-called scientific information. So this is them sampling in a home.
Hey, it's Jordan with TYD Politics, and I've come to kill you! Why do I have a knife and a water bottle? If the EPA is not going to do the testing, I will.
Okay, so he's there with an unsterile water bottle and a kitchen knife in a consumer's basement. This is step one. Step two, they announced their goal is to find things that EPA is not finding in the water.
Scott Smith with the Water Defense Council. He's done private testing in about 30 Flint homes. He has gone through very, very extensively and carefully to find bacteria that the state has not found in Flint. Bacterias in just about every home he's tested. I'm not going to pretend to know the names of the bacteria.
Okay, and then the next question is, well, if the EPA and the CDC and FEMA and every public health agency is saying that there's not problems with bathing in the water, Why should the public listen to you and not them?
Scott Smith with the Water Defense Council. You know, you're more on the scientific end.
I said I don't know whether it's safe to shower and bathe, and I'm not a doctor. I'm not a toxicologist, and I'm no PhD in statistics because I'm not a trained plumber or pipe fitter.
I'm no scientist. I'm no environmental expert. Most of you don't know this, but I was in special ed from 1st to 3rd grade. I had a learning disability. It's a whole story. I don't think I needed to be in special ed. I'm no doctor either. But also, I'm not a medical expert, but I am an expert on what medical experts have told me. Does that sound about right?
Correct.
Yes.
Well said.
Yes, Dr. Sheridan.
Okay, having established your team's scientific credentials in step 3, now proceed to take a sample trying to discover problems in the water by scraping the outside of the basement sewer pipe.
So we're going to be getting water and what looks like a bacterial fungi. We're going to be collecting them, and he's going to be testing them. And by the way, I could barely set up a TV, so this could be tricky. Use the knife to saw. There we go. We're sawing here. Getting every last thing in there. Oh, this is a stubborn one. Yeah, well, it's a lot of it's rust. How much is in the bottom? Do you see any in the bottle already? A little bit. Okay. I'm a righty, so it might be better this way.
Okay, so now that you've sampled the outside of the sewer pipe in your unsterile bottle and unsterile knife,
Not all this stuff.
notice how they continue to process the samples
That in there.
by dropping the bottle cap on the floor and rubbing his finger on his nose. Next slide. Next slide.
Good. Let me just put this on here. No, it really does look like it's hard to set up your VCR. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so now that you've collected the sample, the next thing is to send that sample to an unsuspecting certified lab, because that's the key. They have no idea where this came from, but they're going to give you results. Next slide.
Because the key thing is the independent lab that we go to.
Okay, and then you have a prime time expose on your so-called news station to talk about the results and scare people. Next slide.
On last Friday's Power Panel, we showed you video of TYT Politics' Jordan Sheraton drawing water from a water heater in East Chicago, Indiana, that looked like absolute sewage. Scott Smith of Water Defense was our liaison for that testing. Exactly.
We tested it, and boy, it did not come out good at all.
Exactly.
It came out.
Okay, and then the next slide shows what happens if you get criticized.
Or not, my organization is scientists, because we're admitted, we're citizen scientists, you know? And so all we're doing is giving people information, and there's nothing wrong with that. And the more information people have, the better off they are.
The more information people have, the better off they are. That was the defense. So when we put this up, it turns out Hollywood actors don't like to be criticized. So we were threatened several times by Mr. Ruffalo's attorneys to cease and desist in our work, and we refused to do that. This confrontation was pretty nasty. It went on for several months. It was written up in the New York Times Magazine. And ultimately, Water Defense did leave town. They were quite embarrassed. Unfortunately, this TYN, TYT, whatever network, they kept attacking us. And I got a lot of bad blowback from that. And oddly enough, it didn't stop until the reporter who was doing that work got caught with sexual allegations from having an incident in Flint, and you can read about this online, but he actually got fired from TYT, and that's actually the only thing that ended this sorry episode for us. So for some reason, it always works out for us in the end, or at least it has to date, or until it doesn't. But it was interesting because, next slide, that individual, Scott Smith, who was working with Ruffalo, actually became our friends not long after this. He helped us write a paper talking about, what he had done wrong, and he recanted. He's now something of a friend. I talk to him quite frequently, and he talks about how leaving this organization was like leaving a cult in the paper we wrote. But very, very interesting. So you get an idea of this horror story. You get an idea of the betrayal of Flint residents by everyone, by government, science, Hollywood, exploiting this crisis to the present day for their own personal advantage. And to me, the following clip, which just shows how scared legitimately Flint residents are by not knowing in this loss of trust, shows what a dark age is.
I have stopped using the filters again, and I'm back to bottled water. My water is not corrected. I want to just shower at home. I want to be able to use my water, and I want my kids to be healthy. My one daughter.
And again, as the New York Times recently did an article on this, there are many residents, there are many children who to this day are terrified and would never think about bathing or showering in their tap water, even though it meets all current government safety standards, and you can't really blame them. Next, so, there's just been all this misinformation, and almost all these celebrities weigh in on Flint, even though they don't have a clue what they're talking about, claiming Flint water is still not safe, even though it's been meeting safety standards since 2016. But good luck changing that narrative when there's a political reason to keep pushing it. And so I think you get an idea a little bit about like what my journey's been like for the last 15 years. It's not the road less traveled by, it's the road never traveled by. And speaking the truth is very, very hard to do because mainly people don't want to hear it. Next slide. I sent out some articles that folks could read. It's written up in the Chronicle of Higher Education and the Washington Post and Mother Jones. And what I've come to realize that is in a post-truth world, unfortunately, where our loyalties are misplaced, science has really just become another weapon of tribal warfare. And rising above that not only takes courage as an individual, it's going to take courage as a society. And I wanted to kind of wrap this talk up with a little bit of a historical perspective. I've always been fascinated by history. Maybe I should have been a historian since science and engineering and public health isn't working out that well for me. But, I kind of reflect back on, what's changed in the world. What's changed? I'm 56. I can tell you the way we educate students in this country has totally changed from our grade schools to our graduate schools. And I think really it's not for the better. We're not teaching students about the importance of these higher loyalties. We're many times reinforcing tribalism. And I recall back when I was a freshman in high school, reading an essay on liberty by John Stuart Mill. And, one of the things we were taught is that we need our other tribes. We need our enemies. John Stuart Mill really pointed to the symbiotic relationship between political parties, and that he noted in England that there tends to be a party of order and there tends to be a party of progress or reform. And you need both of those to have a healthy state of political life. And if you don't have a good opposition, whatever party wins will go insane. And so I hope all of you can go and read this essay and think about this, which was written in 1859, by the way, and think also about the arc of history and what happens when one political party becomes too powerful, or when science itself becomes too politicized. And we've got very, very good examples of what happens, and it's horrifying. It's not pretty. So just to give you some historical examples of how bad politicized science led to political totalitarianism. So I hope all of you are aware of the conditions that created Nazi Germany and the final solution over a period of decades. If you're not, please read about it, but National Socialism, all those principles were built on extremist eugenics and social justice science views. That step by step by step, the bad science led to the Holocaust and the final solution. One thing that's not often talked about is there was a competing example that occurred in the Soviet Union at the same time of a differing path for totalitarianism on the left. And I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about this because it's underappreciated. Here's some great books where you can read about it. It's called Hungry Ghosts, The Murder of Nikolai Vavilov, Perversion of Knowledge, Stalin and the Scientists. But basically, science started to reflect political ideology. One of the branches of that horrific scientific misconduct was Lyshenkoism, wherein Lenin believed that science should agree with Marxist principles, so there could be no such thing as competition between species. The whole idea that plants compete with each other for nutrients or for light was blamed on wrong capitalist ideas. And they actually banned Darwinism and Mendelian genetics. And this peasant citizen science, Lyshenko, got on the side of Stalin and claimed to have started making all these scientific, astonishing, politically correct discoveries in agriculture. And they actually tried to implement them, bad science. And real scientists who did not agree with his views, who wanted to believe in genetics, were killed by the hundreds. So what resulted was a great, horrifying human experience in Russia where they collectivized agriculture and started applying ridiculous Lyshenkoist agricultural practices. And one of them involved putting plants really, really close together so you could get more crops per unit acre. And the idea is they don't compete with each other, so you're going to get more food as a result. Well, the unfortunate reality is plants do compete with each other. You have to plant them far enough apart so they get enough light and nutrients. Most people understand that, but if you stated at the time, you would have been shot. So they went ahead with these ridiculous ideas. Next slide. And about 1 to 10 million people died as a result of starvation. And they never admitted their science was crap. Their science didn't work. And so Mao heard about this Lyshenkoism and thought, oh, I'm going to increase my crop yields as well. So they employed those exact failed experiment in communist China, 1958, 1961. And not surprisingly, just like in Russia, the experiment was a horrific failure. One of the worst famines in history resulted. And in all the time, the government's writing this propaganda about how great things are, how much food we have. In the upper right picture, you got children supposedly walking on these close planted wheat. It's so thick, and the yields are supposedly so good. Kids can actually walk on the wheat fields, when in reality it was a staged photo, and they're standing on top of a table. But despite the propaganda, 15 to 45 million people died. 15 to 45 million people died in China. Didn't learn from that lesson. The same thing happened in North Vietnam and Cambodia, where they employed the exact same falsified political science. 1 in 8 people died as a result. So these are things that happen if science becomes politicized and we achieve a totalitarian government, it never ends well at all. So to kind of wrap this up and open it up for questions, I hope at this point you're certainly not as naive as I was at age 40. If you paid attention to a tenth of this, I can tell you that's not possible. But secondly, I just want to leave a quote from the great humanitarian and physicist Albert Einstein, who witnessed this and who famously stated that, you know, the world, when it ends, it won't be destroyed by those who do evil, but by those who watch them without doing anything. And I think you can understand why people are reluctant to get involved and why people are reluctant to speak the truth. But our entire civilization is dependent upon those brave truth seekers and truth speakers. And I hope that some of you someday can become one of those. And so I just acknowledge that I've had worked with a lot of really amazing people over the last 15 years. I've had good support, and I'll open up for questions at this point in time.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Edwards, for joining us today and sharing details about your team's incredible work. While you do not come from the traditional public health field, your work truly impacts the public's health. It was tremendous to learn about the interprofessional collaborations that you have built through your work and how those collaborations have impacted your work. So again, I just want to thank you for being with us today. We do, as you mentioned, have some time for question and answers. If you would like to ask Dr. Edwards a question, as some of you have already started doing, please make sure you send that via the chat function, and I'll relay those questions to Dr. Edwards. Again, before we start with the Q&A, I would like to thank the attendees for joining us today as well. And while we wish our event were in person, I'm pleased that we can gather today and learn more about Dr. Edwards' incredible work. All right, and so with that, Dr. Edwards, we will start with the first question, which was, it comes from a graduate student. What skills do you think are the most important for new public health scientists to have to make the most impact on their communities?
Well, I think it starts by being very careful what you're learning in school and all the ways that we're being pressured and taught to conform. And I think that you have to realize that the greatest impacts are always had by those who see the world differently and who the world can't change. So I often say that those people who are most likely to change the world are those who the world cannot change. So you have to become an independent thinker. You have to read about opposing points of view. You have to view your own ideas very, very critically. You have to question everything and everybody. And that's really hard because the modern world runs on trust. Without trust, we have no civilization as we know it. But I think that's really important. I think learning to seek and speak the truth is important. But the hardest obstacle, I can tell you without question, is dealing with the shunning and shaming that you will experience for doing the right thing. That's why it's so rare. Why is it that you have to be a hero to do your job in today's world? Why is it Miguel del Toro was a hero for simply trying to get EPA to follow the law? The reason is because if you speak the truth and people don't want to hear it, you're going to be punished. This is Dante's innermost layer of human hell, and it's horrible. It is truly horrifying to do the right thing, to be willing to lay down your professional life to uphold the law, and to realize that you're going to be punished and no one's going to appreciate it in all likelihood. So I speak today on behalf of whistleblowers. I know that I'm lucky, okay? for every 100 people who've taken this kind of path, 99 out of 100 end up destroyed and disillusioned. So I kind of speak to honor their sacrifice and to tell everyone else that if this is how we treat truth seekers and truth speakers, why are you surprised when we live in an unjust world? Why are you surprised when we live in a post-truth society? Why do we tolerate this? It's moral cowardice. That's what it is. And so without question, that's the biggest hurdle you're going to have to confront and overcome. And most people can't do it.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that insight, especially for our students who are looking to go into this field. The next question is, well, it starts with a comment and goes into a question. With all of the unfortunate events that led to the progressive and lingering mistrust in Flint, what would you say it would take to rebuild or restore the trust to the residents in that community? And is it even possible, or do you feel that in this case, it has gone to the point of no return to a state of trust?
Well, I know you might be surprised to hear this, but I feel like I'm an optimist, okay? Every day the sun gets up, I feel we've got another chance. You know, the sun rises, we haven't destroyed ourselves yet. And so as long as we have a chance, you got to keep working with optimism to try to change the system. What do you have to lose? The only possible answer to this loss of distrust, and realize this is afflicting every level of society now. Trust in all of our institutions is being deservedly lost because too many of us are untrustworthy. Look at what's happening to trust in government, trust in the media, trust in public health agencies, and what's about to happen to trust in science. The only possible answer is for more of us to be deserving of the public trust, to be honest and truthful, regardless of the cost, and to punish the people who are breaking the laws and scientific norms. That's the only way out. And again, if you run a world by punishing your honest, ethical whistleblowers and rewarding these criminals and promoting them, why are you surprised when we live in an unjust, untrustworthy world? It's that simple. Who gets the rewards? Who gets punishment? Everything's backwards right now. So that's the tall order. Maybe we won't learn. Maybe we'll have to learn the hard way, as we have throughout our history, but I remain hopeful that short of war or revolution or catastrophe, we can be rational. We can change. That's my optimistic message of the day.
Okay, great. So I'm going to take that response. There was another question that was, how are we supposed to trust the CDC or EPA following the colossal mess ups that we've seen, even just from those two examples? So I could take your words that you just mentioned, unless you want to add to that based on the question.
Well, the answer is I don't trust them. You know, I'm a scientist. I grew up worshiping at the altar of science, okay? I don't trust these agencies at all because I know what their culture is like. And until we can change their reward structure, they're not deserving of my trust. I'm sorry. Until the CDC someday acknowledges and apologizes for that falsified report they wrote in Washington, D.C., instead of giving everyone the finger and claiming that, you know, there's nothing you can do to stop us. I mean, I don't know. I'm not going to trust them. You know, in some ways, it's like the problem we have with community policing, right? We gave police people power. Some folks abused that power. That abuse was captured on camera that went viral. People worried, realized there was a problem, and we're now struggling to try to change it, right? We've had no such reckoning with misconduct in science. The harm that's being done, it's occurring silently behind the scenes. It's rare that it's exposed like we were successful in exposing in Washington, D.C. or Flint. So until there's an acknowledgement there's a problem at these agencies and we're all paying a horrible price for it, I don't think we're going to have a critical mass of moral courage to make them reform.
Okay. Kind of piggybacking off of that, there's another comment. There's some parallels that we see with COVID and the stance taken by CDC early in the pandemic. And this is a question of your opinion. How has CDC learned its lesson?
They haven't. They haven't. They, you know, you can't fault them making a judgment call, but there's been several times they made mistakes and they just didn't admit it, covered it up and pretended like it didn't happen. That's not how you build trust, you know. There's nothing wrong as a scientist to come out and frankly say, we were wrong. We made our decision based on this incomplete data at the time. We've since learned this, and now we're correcting the record. But they're too embarrassed to be public about how science is done in a manner that can retain the public trust. I think that's a major mistake. I think people are willing to forgive if you're willing to admit that you made a mistake and the circumstances under which you made the mistake, but they're not willing to admit pretending that the bad advice never happened. And that's happened several times. Now, you can understand it again, but a lot of it is how you just handle it and present it to the public. And if people think there's a pattern of behavior, this is what leads to things like anti-vaccine movements. I work with a lot of folks who are scientifically rational, who were betrayed by a public health agency, and they will never trust a public health agency again, no matter what they say. Once you're burned, you're shy for life.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. And I guess I'll just quote the question. What are some strategies to working within systems of corrupt leadership?
Well, you know, I think that unfortunately you have to fight, and you have to fight to win. And that's hard to do because the only way you can reason with unreasonable people is, as I did in Flint, and it hurt me, is to embarrass them. It's to humiliate them. I don't like to do that. I like to think that I'm a nice person. I lost sleep having to do what I did in Flint to expose this crime. But again, it comes down to your loyalties. I did not get into science and engineering to stand by and let innocent children be hurt. I won't stand by. I will not live in a world where science and engineering is used to betray the public trust and hurt children. I will not live in that world. So, yeah, you end up making some horrible decisions. You're going to be punished. You know, either you ignore the problem and look the other way, like most people are trained to do, and let that harm perpetuate, or you fight and you fight to win, and you live with the guilty conscience of having to do some very distasteful things. That's the decision you have to make. I wish we lived in a world where you could reason with people. You have to, as a whistleblower, exhaust that possibility, as we did in Flint, as we did in DC. You try to reach out. You try to reason with them. That's what science is about. But when folks won't return your phone calls, and when they attack you and undermine you and attack your reputation, and usually they win, you have to fight back, and you have to fight back to win.
Okay. So this next question probably kind of feeds off of that one as well. When one starts their career, they often don't feel powerful or empowered. As our careers evolve, how do you check your moral compass is aligned on the side of truth and advocacy and not becoming a bad actor?
Yeah, that is a wonderful, wonderful question. As are all of these, by the way. I can only speak for myself. You know, we all have a unique background that makes us who we are. And frankly, until I was 40 years old, I faked it. You know, I went along with the crowd, partly because I believed in what we were doing. I thought we were the good guys. And had I not done that, I never would have risen to a point where I could have had the power to do what I did in DC and Flint. And so there's actually a pretty famous book that's called Disciplined Minds, where the author wrote how institutions make you into conformist and basically take your soul away if you're not careful. And they give strategies in there to kind of pretend and go along with things, but never forget who you are. And actually, one of the things they cite, and this is going to sound a little bit funny, but it's not, is to survive and maintain your moral compass, they recommend that you read books from the Army on how to survive in a prisoner of war camp in an occupied territory. And they recommended that all graduate students read that. So, all right, that might be a little bit extreme, but you have to realize that at all times, the world is trying to change you. At all times, institutions are trying to make you a conformist. They're trying to make your highest loyalty to your friends and to your institution. And if that ever happens, you're right. You will never be there to do what you have to do when your moment comes. You will have become willfully blind. The world will have changed you, and you're going to be part of the system. And that's the default condition, by the way. That is the easy path. Very few people can resist.
And so did I hear you correctly in saying that for a while you kind of played along until you got to a certain point? And kind of with that, were you ever fearful for your life when you started fighting to expose the truth?
Yeah, so in answer to the first question, it's worse than playing along. I honestly had drank in the Kool-Aid. I believed in the groups that I belonged to. I believed it with all my soul that we were the good guys. And so that was really the hard part, was realizing, no, in these particular isolated instances, we were not the good folks. We were the bad folks. So somehow I was able to snap out of it. And I think that's, part of what made me successful in the early phase, because I wasn't pretending. Like, I really believed. And burning those bridges was, one of the hardest things that I've ever done. In terms of fearing for my life, yeah, there's a couple of examples. One where, there a lot of bad things have happened. I'm writing a book on it right now. But I'll tell you one example. I was in DC, and I was speaking against the water utility and saying how they were covering up the lead in water. And it was late at night. I went out in the parking garage, and I was going to my car. It was about midnight, and 3 huge employees from the water company started walking after me with a lead pipe. Each of them had a lead pipe. And I thought, oh my gosh, I started walking fast, and they started running and said, Dr. Edwards. And they started running after me. I'm like, okay, this is it. My life's going to end like a Clue game. Dr. Edwards killed with a lead pipe in a DC parking garage, right? So they get up to me, and I turn to face my fate, right? And they hand me the lead pipe as nice as could be and said, we thought you might want this for your research. And it turned out these employees were whistleblowers, and the management was trying to break their union. So after I realized I had not soiled myself, we had a nice long conversation, but that was one moment where I thought I was going to lose my life, but obviously I didn't. It turned out to be something quite different. And generally speaking, I think that there's some truth in that story that facing your worst fears, sometimes it's not as bad as you think.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. This is kind of going back to the work or some of the things that happened in Flint. One of the saddest parts of this story is that these crises will create a legacy of distrust that will last for generations, like what happened with the Tuskegee study. Is it really difficult? It is really difficult to intervene with those long held beliefs. What communication strategies do you think would work?
In my experience, the only thing that works is telling the complete and total truth as you see it.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is people don't want to hear it. So one of the ironic things about Flint is, and it's a horrible tragedy, maybe a worse tragedy than the original crisis, is you've got the media and parents having told young children that they've been brain damaged and can't learn. That's not true. Now, people are doing that for political advantage. They want to get money to help those children. But there's a cost associated with that, right? What did those children believe? You know, we went to Flint schools and we were horrified to hear little 4- and 5-year-olds tell us not only they're afraid of bathing for no good reason, but that they have been brain damaged and can't learn, which is completely false. You've got a whole generation who believe they've been exposed to an injustice, the likes of which never happened. What happened was horrible enough. You don't need to exaggerate it to get a political advantage. So, yeah, telling the truth at some point is going to make just about everyone mad at you. You know, they're going to be friends with you one day and not friends the next day, depending upon what you're saying. It shouldn't be that way. That's how it is. But I think the only answer is to tell the complete, total, honest truth, no matter when and where, and no matter who it makes mad at you. And I guarantee you, if you do that, you will lose your friends. People don't want to hear the truth. That's why it's unpopular. But I think that's the only answer, is honesty and good sound science and a whole lot of humility. And realizing you're only, as good as your last mistake. Your next mistake is right around the corner if you're not careful. And there's a shocking lack of humility in today's world too. I can tell you that much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for answering that. And I think this will be our last question because of time. It's kind of 2-in-1. It's clear you are a very strong person. What has been your life experiences that has allowed you to have this superhuman strength to fight in the face of adversity? Was it mentors or your upbringing? And then the second part to that is, what happened to you at the age of 40 that kind of caused you to switch?
Well, I don't feel like I have any kind of superhuman powers or anything other than I value loyalty to the truth and humankind above everything else. I would lay down my life, mortal and professional, for the truth and for humankind. I would do that. And I think that's rare, but it comes down to what are you loyal to? And that's my answer. And for me, what happened at 40 was I was ashamed. I was ashamed beyond all belief that a group I belonged to could betray the public and the truth and harm vulnerable citizens who depended upon us. to provide them with safe drinking water. I cannot tell you how powerful I feel that shame to be a part of a group that would do that. And, you know, I will bear any price to stop that. You know, if that's my tribe, I'm calling you out, okay? I have betrayed some of my best friends because they lied and wrote falsified scientific papers, and I will do it again. So what caused me to, at age 40, to take not the path less traveled by, but the path almost never traveled by? It was shame, absolute shame that my tribe could betray humankind the way we did in Washington, D.C. and Flint.
Great. Thank you so much for your insightful responses to the questions. Dr. Edwards, I want to thank you for joining us, and thank you to our audience for your questions and for attending the annual lecture. And at this time, this concludes today's session.
You're an awesome audience. Great questions. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much, Dr. Edwards. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.